The dinner party was flawless, vintage Cabernet, soft jazz, and the envy of every couple in the Seattle suburbs, until the notification lit up Ethan's phone, turning the screen into a blinding verdict. He didn't flip the table or scream. He simply looked at his wife, Elena, who was laughing at a joke across the candlelight, and realized that her smile belonged to a stranger. It is often the silence, not the shouting, that marks the true end of a marriage, leaving a ghost where a husband used to be. If you find yourself drawn to stories about the quiet wreckage behind closed doors and the secrets that time refuses to bury, please stay with me. There are many more layers to peel back, and I'd love for you to be here for the revelation. The rain in Seattle didn't wash things clean. It just made them slick, dangerous, and harder to hold on to. Ethan Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his master bedroom, the glass reflecting a man who looked composed, almost statuesque. He was 34 years old, an architect who specialized in load-bearing structures, in calculating exactly how much weight a beam could take before it snapped. Tonight he was calculating his own breaking point. In his hand, he held a standard envelope from a private genetics lab. It had been opened with a letter opener, a clean slit across the top. No jagged edges. Behind him, the soft, rhythmic breathing of his wife, Elena, filled the room. She was 7 months pregnant. In the dim light of the hallway lamp, the curve of her body under the silk sheets looked like a landscape he had spent years mapping, cherishing, and protecting. They had named the baby Lucas 3 days ago. They had painted the nursery a soft sage green. They had bought the crib made of sustainable oak. Ethan looked down at the paper again. The probability of paternity was 0.0%. The numbers were clinically cold. They didn't care about the Sunday mornings making pancakes. They didn't care about the nights he had spent holding Elena's hair back while she dealt with morning sickness, whispering that she was beautiful, that they were doing this together. 0.0%. He didn't feel the heat of anger. That was the most terrifying part. He expected to feel a volcanic eruption of rage, the kind that leads to broken mirrors and screaming matches that wake the neighbors. Instead, he felt a vacuum. A sudden, absolute zero. The love he had for Elena hadn't turned into hate. It had simply evaporated, instantly replaced by the terrifying clarity of a stranger looking at a stranger. Ethan turned and looked at her sleeping form. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, a message lighting up the screen. He didn't need to check it. He knew the name that would be there. Julian. The struggling artist she had sworn was just a friend from the gallery, the one she had comforted when his portfolio was rejected, the one whose chaotic vulnerability was so different from Ethan's structured stability. Ethan walked to the walk-in closet. He didn't turn on the light. He didn't need to. He knew where his suitcase was. He packed methodically. 3 suits, his drafting portfolio, his passport, the watch his grandfather gave him. He didn't take the wedding album. He didn't take the framed photo of them in Paris. He took nothing that belonged to the us that had existed until 10 minutes ago. The silence in the house was heavy, pressurized. Every zip of the suitcase sounded like a gunshot to his ears, but Elena didn't stir. She was sleeping the sleep of the safe, of the woman who believed her secrets were buried deep enough to never sprout. 10 minutes later, Ethan stood by the side of the bed. He looked at her one last time. He tried to find a trace of the woman he had married, but all he saw was a masterful forgery, a beautiful facade with a condemned foundation. He placed the single sheet of paper, the DNA result, on her nightstand, directly on top of her buzzing phone. He didn't write a note. He didn't ask for an explanation. Words were for negotiation, for fixing things. Ethan wasn't trying to fix this. He was demolishing it. He walked out of the bedroom, down the floating staircase he had designed himself, and out the front door. The cool night air hit him, wet and smelling of pine and exhaust. He got into his Audi, the leather cold against his back. He didn't look back at the house. He simply put the car in gear and drove toward the interstate. The rain picked up, blurring the rearview mirror, washing away the driveway, the house, and the life he had built, until there was nothing left but the road ahead and the silence he brought with him. He was gone before she even opened her eyes. The Interstate 5 South was a ribbon of wet asphalt stretching endlessly into the darkness. Ethan kept the speedometer at exactly 65 miles per hour. He wasn't running. Running implied panic. This was a relocation, a strategic withdrawal. At 4:13 a.m., he pulled into a brightly lit rest stop near Tacoma. The fluorescent lights of the vending machines buzzed with an irritating hum, the only sound competing with the rain drumming on the metal roof of the car. He didn't get out to buy coffee. He had work to do. Ethan unlocked his phone. The wallpaper was still a picture of Elena, her hand resting on her baby bump, smiling at him on a beach in Maui. He stared at it for 3 seconds, not with longing, but with the detached scrutiny of an insurance adjuster assessing a totaled vehicle. Then he opened his banking app. His fingers moved with practiced speed. The joint savings account, the one they had started for the forever home, was drained first. He transferred exactly half of the balance to a new private offshore account he had set up an hour ago, leaving the other half for her. He wasn't a thief, he was just settling the ledger. Next, the joint checking, then the credit cards. He removed his name from authorized users, freezing the limits. Notifications began to pile up. At the top of the screen, transfer complete, card removed. Alert, unusual activity. He swiped them away. Next was the email. He drafted a single message to the senior partners at his firm. It was brief, professional, and catastrophic for his career in Washington. Effective immediately, I am resigning due to a personal emergency. I will not be returning. Please forward all pending drafts to the junior associates. He hit send without rereading it. He had just torched 15 years of professional reputation in 2 sentences, yet his pulse remained steady. The sun began to bleed into the sky, a bruised purple turning into a sickly gray. The world was waking up. Back in the house on the hill, the alarm would be going off in 20 minutes. Elena would reach across the bed, her hand patting the empty space where his warmth should be. She would frown, confused, perhaps thinking he was in the kitchen making coffee. Then she would see the paper. Ethan rolled down the window. The morning air was cold and smelled of diesel and wet earth. He looked at the phone one last time. It was the only thing tracking him, the only umbilical cord connecting him to the life of Ethan Vance, husband and father-to-be. He powered it down. He removed the SIM card, snapping the small plastic chip in half with his thumbnail. It gave a satisfying click. He walked over to a trash can overflowing with fast food wrappers and discarded coffee cups. He dropped the phone into the muck. It slid down between a greasy burger wrapper and a crumpled newspaper. Ethan walked back to his car, the gravel crunching loudly under his dress shoes. He got in, adjusted the rearview mirror, and merged back onto the highway. The silence in the car was absolute now. No GPS voice, no incoming vehicles, no digital heartbeat. He was a ghost, and for the first time since opening the envelope, he could breathe. Elena woke to the sensation of cold sheets. It wasn't unusual for Ethan to be up early. He was a man of routines, of 5 a.m. runs and espresso measured to the gram. But the quality of the silence in the house felt wrong. It was too still. It lacked the subtle vibrations of life, the hum of the grinder, the shower running, the heavy tread of his footsteps. She stretched, her hand brushing the nightstand, seeking her phone. Her fingers met paper instead. She sat up, blinking against the gray morning light filtering through the blinds. The document was crisp, unfolded, sitting atop her phone like a verdict. She picked it up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. It took her brain a moment to process the logo of the genetics lab and another long, suspended second to comprehend the numbers. Probability of paternity, 0.0%. The breath left her lungs in a sharp, audible gasp. It wasn't a scream. It was the sound of a vacuum sealing shut. She looked at the empty space beside her, the pillow perfectly smooth, uncreased as if Ethan had never laid his head there. Ethan? Her voice cracked, small and pathetic in the vast, vaulted bedroom. She grabbed her phone. The screen was cluttered with missed notifications, but not from him. She dialed his number. It didn't ring. It went straight to a mechanical operator message. The number you have dialed is no longer in service. She dialed again and again. Her fingers trembled so violently, she dropped the phone onto the duvet. He hadn't just turned it off. He had disconnected the line. Panic, cold and prickly, began to crawl up her spine. She checked her banking app, hoping to see a transaction for coffee or get something to locate him. Instead, she saw the transfers. The savings halved. The credit cards grayed out. He knew. He knew everything. And he hadn't stayed to fight. He hadn't stayed to yell. He had simply erased himself. Nausea rolled over her, a physical wave that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. She scrambled out of bed, running through the house. The closet was missing his suits. The bathroom counter was stripped of his razor and cologne. The house was a skeleton, beautiful and hollow. Desperation clawed at her throat. She needed someone. She couldn't call her mother. Her mother worshipped Ethan and would view this as a moral failing of biblical proportions. She couldn't call her friends. They were the wives of Ethan's colleagues. She dialed Julian. Julian answered on the fifth ring, his voice groggy and irritated, the sound of traffic in the background suggesting he was already out, or perhaps just coming home from a night out. "Elena, it's early. What's going on?" "He knows," she whispered, clutching the kitchen island for support. "Ethan knows. He did a test. He left, Julian. He's gone." There was a pause on the line, not a pause of concern, but of calculation. "Okay," Julian said slowly, his voice detaching. "That sounds intense." "It's not intense. It's a disaster." He emptied the accounts. He disconnected his phone. "I'm pregnant, Julian. The baby is yours." The silence that followed was longer this time, sharper. She could hear him lighting a cigarette, the lighter flicking 3 times before catching. "Look, Elena," Julian said, his tone shifting to the defensive cadence of a man who avoids consequences for a living. "We talked about this. We had a moment. A fun moment. I'm an artist. I can barely pay rent on my studio. I'm not father material. You know that. I don't need you to be a father right now. I need help," she cried, tears finally spilling over. "I'm alone here." "I can't help you," Julian said, the cruelty of his cowardice cutting deeper than Ethan's silence. "This is your mess. Don't drag me into a custody battle or whatever this is. Lose my number, Elena. Seriously." The line went dead. Elena stood in the center of the immaculate kitchen Ethan had designed, the phone slipping from her hand to the marble floor. The sound of it hitting the stone echoed like a gavel. The house was massive, expensive, and terrifyingly empty. She placed a hand on her stomach, feeling the movement of the child inside. A child created in a moment of recklessness that had just cost her her entire world. The labor had lasted 22 hours, but for Elena, the true pain began only when the screaming stopped. She lay in a recovery room that smelled of industrial bleach and stale cafeteria coffee. It was not the private ocean view suite at Swedish Medical Center that Ethan had reserved months ago. That reservation had been canceled along with the credit cards. This was a shared room in a county hospital, separated from the weeping woman in the next bed by a thin stained curtain. In the plastic bassinet beside her bed lay the boy. The nurses called him healthy. They called him alert. Elena called him nothing. She hadn't named him. On the birth certificate, the space for father was a blank line that felt wider than a canyon. She turned her head to look at the infant. He was sleeping, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that should have sparked a fierce, protective fire in her chest. Instead, she felt a cold, terrifying numbness. When she looked at his face, she didn't see innocence. She saw Julian's jawline. She saw the night in the gallery. She saw the precise moment her life with Ethan had shattered. He wasn't a baby. He was living evidence of a catastrophe. A social worker, a woman with kind eyes and a clipboard that looked too heavy for her tired hands, stood at the foot of the bed. Her name tag read Mrs. Gable. "Elena," Mrs. Gable said softly, trying to bridge the distance. "You don't have to decide today. You can take him to temporary foster care. You can apply for assistance. There are programs." "I can't take him," Elena said, her voice raspy. She stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the water stains to keep from falling apart. "I have no job. I have no home. My parents won't speak to me. If I take him—" She paused, the truth lodging in her throat like a shard of glass. "If I take him, I will resent him every day of his life. and he doesn't deserve that. The lie of the maternal instinct had been exposed. She was not a mother. She was a survivor clinging to the wreckage, and this child was the anchor pulling her down. "We can arrange a closed adoption," Mrs. Gable said, her tone professional but laced with pity. The records would be sealed. He would go to a family waiting for a child, a family ready to provide what you feel you cannot. What you feel you cannot. The polite way of saying what you are too broken to give. Elena sat up, the pain in her abdomen flaring sharp and hot. "Do it. Closed. No contact. I don't want him to know who I was. I don't want him to know why I..." Mrs. Gable hesitated, then handed her the papers and a pen. The pen felt heavy, like lead. Elena looked at the bassinet one last time. The baby shifted, letting out a small, soft sigh. For a fleeting second, her heart clenched. A biological reflex, a ghost of the mother she was supposed to be. But then the image of Ethan's back as he walked out of the bedroom flashed in her mind. The silence of the empty house. The eviction notice on the counter. She uncapped the pen. She signed her name, Elena Marie Vance. With each stroke of the pen, she severed a tether. She was signing away a life. She told herself it was mercy. She told herself she was saving him from a mother who looked at him and saw only regret. But as she handed the clipboard back, she knew the truth. She wasn't saving him. She was trying to save herself. "His name is Leo," she whispered, the name slipping out before she could stop it. "Put that in the file. Just Leo." Mrs. Gable nodded and wheeled the bassinet away. Elena turned her face to the wall and closed her eyes, waiting for the sound of the wheels to fade, leaving her alone in the crushing quiet she had earned. 20 years had turned Ethan Vance into a monolith. He sat in the corner office on the 42nd floor of a skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan, a building he had designed. His hair was now a shock of iron gray, cut with military precision, and the lines around his eyes were deep, etched by decades of staring at blueprints and avoiding mirrors. He was 54, wealthy beyond measure, and entirely alone. His firm, Vance & Partners, was known for two things: brutalist modernism and a turnover rate that terrified headhunters. Ethan demanded perfection because perfection was controllable. People were messy, steel and glass were not. "Mr. Vance?" The voice came from the doorway. Ethan didn't look up from the tablet where he was reviewing the schematics for a library in Dubai. "I told the assistant I wasn't to be disturbed, Miss Claire." "It's not Miss Claire, sir. It's the new summer associate, the scholarship placement." Ethan finally looked up. Standing in the doorway was a young man, barely 20. He was wearing a suit that was clearly bought off the rack, slightly ill-fitting at the shoulders, but he wore it with a nervous, hungry energy that filled the room. He had dark, curly hair and eyes that held a familiar, restless intensity. "You have 3 minutes," Ethan said, removing his glasses. "Impress me or leave." The boy walked forward, bypassing the pleasantries. He placed a roll of vellum on Ethan's mahogany desk. "The wind shear calculations for the West Tower are wrong," the boy said. His voice shook slightly, but his hands were steady as he unrolled the drawing. "The plaza creates a wind tunnel effect. If you build it like this, the pedestrian entrance will be unusable 6 months of the year." Ethan stared at the drawing. He looked at the red ink corrections the boy had made. They were bold, intuitive, and absolutely correct. It was a mistake a senior architect had missed, caught by a kid who probably took the subway here from a shared apartment in Queens. "What is your name?" Ethan asked, the ice in his voice thawing by a fraction of a degree. "Leo," the boy said. "Leo Sterling." Ethan studied him. There was something about the boy's jawline, the way he held his pen, that triggered a phantom memory in the back of Ethan's mind, a ghost of a feeling he couldn't place. It wasn't recognition. It was resonance. He saw a hunger in Leo that he remembered feeling himself, back before the world had taught him that building walls was safer than building bridges. "You're an orphan, aren't you, Leo?" The question was invasive, rude, and uncharacteristic. Ethan didn't know why he asked it. Leo didn't flinch. He rolled the drawing back up. "Adopted, sir. Closed file. But I grew up figuring things out on my own, if that's what you mean." A silence stretched between them, but for the first time in 20 years, it wasn't a hostile silence. It was a shared frequency. Ethan saw a young man with no history, trying to build a future. He saw himself. The wind tunnel fix is smart, Ethan said, picking up his pen, but your aesthetic solution is clumsy. It lacks elegance. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper forward. Pull up a chair. Let me show you how to fix the structure without ruining the line. Leo's eyes widened, a spark of genuine awe lighting up his face. He pulled the chair closer. As they worked, sketching lines in the quiet hum of the high-rise, Ethan felt a strange foreign sensation in his chest. It was the feeling of a legacy beginning. He had no son, no heir, no one to leave his empire to. But looking at this kid with his cheap suit and his brilliant mind, Ethan thought that maybe, just maybe, he had found someone worth teaching. He didn't know he was looking at the son he had walked out on. He didn't know he was teaching the boy to build the very trap that would eventually snare them both. The private jet began its descent through the thick cloud layer, the cabin turbulence jolting Ethan out of a shallow, restless sleep. Outside the oval window, the Pacific Northwest greeted him the only way it knew how, with a curtain of gray rain and a landscape of deep, melancholy greens. "Seatbelt sign is on, sir," the flight attendant said softly, taking his untouched glass of sparkling water. Ethan stared at the ground, rising to meet them. He hadn't set foot in Washington state in 2 decades. He had built skyscrapers in Dubai, libraries in London, and concert halls in Shanghai, but he had carefully engineered his firm's portfolio to avoid this specific corner of the map. Until now. The commission for the Seattle Contemporary Art Museum's new wing was too prestigious to refuse, and the board had specifically requested the visionary touch of Ethan Vance. Across the aisle, Leo was vibrating with energy. He was 22 now, 2 years into his apprenticeship, and sharper than any junior architect Ethan had ever employed. He was reviewing the digital renderings on his tablet, his eyes darting back and forth with obsessive focus. "The light integration in the atrium is going to be a problem with this cloud cover," Leo muttered, more to himself than to Ethan. "We might need to adjust the skylight angles by 3 degrees. Ethan looked at the young man. He felt a surge of protective pride. Leo was the son he had chosen, the mind he had molded. He was the only person in the world Ethan trusted. "We'll assess it on site," Ethan said, his voice tighter than usual. "Focus on the presentation. The museum liaison is a stickler for historical preservation." "I'm ready," Leo said, grinning. "We're going to blow them away, Ethan." Ethan didn't smile back. He felt a phantom weight on his chest, a tightening of the throat that felt suspiciously like panic. The car ride from the airport was a blur of wet pavement and familiar landmarks that had aged just as he had. The city was denser now, taller, but the bones were the same. They passed the exit for the suburb where he used to live, where a house with a nursery painted sage green had once stood. Ethan looked straight ahead, his jaw set so hard it ached. They arrived at the museum, a hulking structure of concrete and glass overlooking the Sound. The rain was relentless as the driver opened the door with an umbrella. Ethan stepped out, the damp air hitting him like a physical blow. It smelled of salt and memories. "Let's get this over with," Ethan muttered. They walked through the grand lobby, their footsteps echoing on the terrazzo floor. The receptionist directed them to the boardroom on the 3rd floor. Leo walked slightly ahead, carrying the portfolio case, eager and confident. Ethan lagged a step behind, adjusting his cufflinks, armoring himself. The double doors to the conference room were open. Inside, a group of board members in expensive suits were chatting amiably. But Ethan's eyes bypassed them entirely, drawn like a magnet to the woman standing at the far end of the long oak table, arranging water pitchers. She was thinner than he remembered. Her hair, once a vibrant chestnut, was pulled back in a severe, sensible bun, streaked with gray. She wore a modest, nondescript blouse that spoke of a budget, not a fashion statement. She looked tired. She looked worn down by the friction of living. "Gentlemen," the board chairman announced, spotting them, "Mr. Vance has arrived." The woman at the end of the table froze. The pitcher of water in her hand trembled, the ice clinking loudly against the glass. Slowly, terrifyingly, she turned around. Elena looked at him. Her face went pale, drained of all blood, leaving her looking like a statue of shock. Her eyes widened, taking in the silver hair, the expensive suit, the sheer impossibility of the man standing in the doorway. Ethan felt the world tilt on its axis. He didn't say a word. He didn't blink. He just let the silence stretch between them, heavy and suffocating, bridging 20 years of absence in a single heartbeat. Then Elena's gaze drifted slightly to the right, landing on the young man standing next to Ethan. She looked at Leo, his dark curls, his jawline, the way he stood with his weight on one leg. Her breath hitched, a small, strangled sound that no one else heard. Ethan stepped forward, his voice cold as steel. "Ms. Vance," he said, using the name she had kept, the name that felt like a theft. "Shall we begin?" The meeting was a blur of architectural jargon and polite nods, a theater of professionalism played out over an abyss of unsaid words. Elena sat at the far end of the mahogany table, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned white. She wasn't listening to the budget projections. She was listening to the blood rushing in her ears, a roar that drowned out the rain tapping against the museum windows. Ethan sat opposite her. He hadn't looked at her since that initial freezing greeting. He watched the screen where the digital renderings of the new wing were being projected, his face a mask of critical concentration. He was older, harder, worn down by time in a way that made him look like the stone structures he built, imposing and impenetrable. "And if you look at the elevation here," a younger voice said, commanding the room, "we've integrated the natural light to minimize UV damage to the collection while maximizing the view of the sound." Elena forced her eyes to move from Ethan to the young man standing by the screen. Leo. He moved with a kinetic energy that felt violently familiar. When he pointed at the schematic, his wrist turned in a specific, disjointed way. A gesture she hadn't seen in 20 years. Not since she stood in a drafty studio watching a painter frantically mix colors. It was Julian's gesture. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Elena leaned forward slightly, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She studied his face, really studied it, stripping away the professional suit and the confident posture. She saw the shape of the eyes, almond, slightly downturned. Her eyes. She saw the stubborn set of the jaw. Julian's jaw. "Leo," she whispered, the name catching in her throat, inaudible to the room. Her mind raced back to the hospital room, to the smell of bleach in the heavy clipboard. His name is Leo, just Leo. She looked at the nameplate on the table in front of him. Leo Sterling, junior associate. The timeline crashed down on her. 20 years. The closed adoption. The boy she had surrendered to the state because she couldn't bear to look at him, because he was the embodiment of her sin. And now, by some cruel, impossible geometric joke of the universe, he was here. But the true horror wasn't just his presence. It was the dynamic. "Leo, go back to the previous slide," Ethan said, his voice low and authoritative. "Right, 1 second," Leo replied, clicking the remote. He glanced at Ethan, seeking approval, and Ethan gave a barely perceptible nod, a micro-expression of pride that Elena knew intimately. It was the look Ethan used to give her when she curated a perfect show. Elena felt a sob rising in her chest, hot and acidic. She swallowed it down, tasting bile. They had a shorthand, a rhythm. They finished each other's sentences. Ethan, the man who had left her because of this boy's conception, was now the father figure this boy looked up to. Ethan didn't know. He couldn't know. To him, Leo was just a talented stray he had picked up in New York. But to Elena, the irony was a physical disfigurement. She had thrown her son away to save her marriage, only to lose the marriage anyway. And now the husband who left her had unknowingly adopted the son she abandoned. "Ms. Vance?" Elena snapped her head up. The room was looking at her. The lights had come up. Leo was standing near her, offering a set of blueprints. He was close enough that she could smell his cologne. Sandalwood and cedar, the same scent Ethan wore. "We need your signature on the preliminary site assessment," Leo said, smiling politely. Her eyes looked at her with zero recognition. To him, she was just a client, a pretty middle-aged woman in a gray cardigan. Elena reached for the pen. Her hand shook so violently that the tip of the pen skittered across the paper, leaving a jagged, ugly mark. "I'm sorry," she stammered, pulling her hand back as if the paper were burning. I haven't eaten. Low blood sugar." Here, Leo said, his voice kind, instinctual. He reached for the water pitcher, the same one she had abandoned earlier, and poured a glass. He slid it toward her. Drink this. It was a small act of kindness. A son taking care of a mother who was a stranger to him. Elena looked at the water, then at Ethan. Ethan was watching the interaction, his expression unreadable, his eyes cold and distant. He didn't see the tragedy. He only saw a delay in the schedule. Thank you, Elena whispered to her son. She took the glass, the condensation cold against her fingers, and realized she was the only ghost in the room. The meeting ended not with a bang, but with the shuffling of papers and the snapping of briefcase latches. The board members filed out, shaking hands, murmuring about visionary concepts and structural integrity. Elena lingered. She watched Ethan and Leo pack up their materials. They moved in sync, a seamless dance of mentor and protege. Ethan handed Leo the portfolio case. Leo took it without looking, knowing exactly the weight in the grip. It was a level of intimacy that took years to build, the kind of intimacy Elena had once shared with Ethan, before she traded it for a secret she couldn't keep. She followed them out to the museum entrance. The rain had turned into a deluge, blurring the city lights into streaks of neon and gray. Valets were running back and forth with black umbrellas. "Mr. Vance, your car's pulling up," the doorman announced. Ethan buttoned his coat against the chill. He turned to Leo. "You handled the questions about the foundation well, but next time don't apologize for the ball. Its quality is expensive." "Got it," Leo said, grinning. "No apologies." Elena stepped out of the shadow of the pillars. The damp air clung to her skin. "Ethan," she said. He stopped. He didn't turn fully, just angled his head, his profile sharp against the wet streetlights. Leo stopped too, looking at her with that polite, distant curiosity. "Ms. Vance," Ethan said. His voice was devoid of hate. It was simply empty. It was the voice you use for a stranger who has mistaken you for someone else. "The boy," Elena started, her voice trembling. She looked at Leo, who was checking his watch, eager to be gone, eager to be back in the world he understood. He's very talented. He reminds me of, he has a good eye." She wanted to say, "He has my eyes. He has his father's hands. He was born in room 402 of the county hospital on a Tuesday." But the words died in her throat. Ethan stepped between her and Leo. It was a subtle movement, a shifting of weight, but the message was clear. "He is not yours. He is mine." "He is exceptional," Ethan said, looking directly at her. "He built himself up from nothing. He knows the value of loyalty, and he knows that structure relies on honesty. If the foundation is rotten, the house falls." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a metaphor. It was the obituary of their marriage, spoken in the presence of the son she had thrown away. "Leo," Ethan said, turning his back on her. "The car." "Coming, boss," Leo said. He glanced at Elena one last time. There was no biological pull, no magical spark of recognition. Just a young man looking at a middle-aged woman standing alone in the rain. "Nice meeting you, ma'am." "Ma'am," the word was a wall. They got into the waiting black sedan. Ethan didn't look back. Leo didn't look back. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing them inside their warm, dry, shared world. Elena stood on the curb as the car pulled away, its taillights dissolving into the red blur of traffic. She touched her own face, her fingers tracing the line of her jaw, the shape of her eyes, the features she had passed down but had no right to claim. She had been terrified 20 years ago that the truth would destroy her life. Standing there in the cold, she realized she had been wrong. The truth hadn't destroyed her life. The silence had. And now the silence was all she had left. The rain washed over her, cold and indifferent, as the city continued to move, leaving her exactly where she belonged, in the past.